What is up, my ninjas? I am Strydent, and welcome to today's video. Today we're going to talk about perfection and expectation. Shit, it has been a long while. Or at least it feels like a long while in like YouTube time. You know what I mean? YouTube time always seems heightened. But, so something we always hear when it comes to reviews and action figures and like an appraisal of these figures is, it's okay for what it is. And usually when you hear this means that whoever's talking about this figure had different expectations for what it was they were going to look at, and somehow those weren't met. This creates that question: was it actually a fair appraisal? Were their expectations set correctly? Were they expecting more from the figure than what it does? I mean, if you notice, I'm showing you a bunch of old figures, and all of these old figures were the standard at some point in time. You know what I mean? And people would say, oh, it's okay for what it was, but it's like, no, it was the standard, meaning it was the best you could get at that time. There wasn't anything better. That custom was the best I could do at the time. So for me at the time, it was perfect. You know what I mean? But we all know that, like, we ended up with very good representations of these figures that set out to do whatever the standard was at the time. Now, you hear nothing is perfect, but again, this is a question of setting your expectations correctly. I'm showing you the 87, 88 Ninja Turtles action figures. These were the standard, and they were by far the best Ninja Turtles that we had for a long time. Even amongst all the different iterations of the Playmates 5, 6, whatever how many points of articulation these were for the time, these were the best. You know what I mean? Up until we got to like the modern era, The same goes for the Kenner, various Kenner action figures, like 5 points of articulation, but the likeness was there, the toughness was there. You could actually play with the figures. Many of the actions and things were perfect for the time, right? Then we moved closer to the modern era. This is the early 2000s. I know we jumped very far, but this was how it started, and it was perfection. Comic book oriented. All the details that were present in the comics are present here on the figures. The articulation was good enough that you could make Batman kick and punch people and swing, and you could make Superman fly. He even had added articulation in his feet so that you could point his feet when he's in flight. That was perfection when you have tempered expectations for the time. We couldn't have expected these figures to do more because at the time, I think the only thing we could have compared them to was DC Collectibles. You did have the Spider-Man classics, right? I don't have any more of those. I sold almost all the ones I had, so I have these guys. These are the early Toy Biz action figures. One of them is kind of a little bit later than the other, but Cap is like the first Marvel Legend, and he scratched that itch for all this articulation and essentially the silhouette of a comic book superhero as we wanted. And I mean, Spider-Man, that is the perfect Spider-Man up until probably, I still think his silhouette is nearly perfect, and he can do so much that like even these newer, more expensive Mafex figures, more expensive Sentinel figures, they can't do a lot of the stuff he does. I mean, that stance right there, many of the figures that are more expensive, like there's no Marvel Legend that can assume that pose yet, and now they're adding the toe hinge, and they're trying to make it seem like it's a big, like, give us props, we're giving you something new. This figure is from the early 2000s, and it had that already. Captain America, the first Marvel Legend, already had that toe articulation as well as hand articulation. Now, say what you will about whether or not you like it, but for the time, this was the standard. This was the benchmark. You know what I mean? And from here, we grew or we regressed. Certain companies chose to add to this, and you have like import figures, and you have, you know, some of the more high end modern figures, and then other companies chose to regress, and you have figures like what Hasbro did, where they just got rid of 95% of all this articulation and gave you piecemeal, kind of like Madden every year. Let's cut out, or FIFA, let's cut out this thing and give you that thing. Then next year we'll cut out the thing we gave you last year and we'll give you another thing. You know what I mean? That you already had. And you'll feel like it's new because you've been without it for a long time. But it doesn't take away from the fact that this was the standard. Everything I showed you just now set the standard for everything to come after it. So let's dig a little bit deeper. A lot of times it seems like the history, how we got to these places, is always forgotten when people start to appraise what it is that we have. You know what I mean? They're just like, oh, it's new, it's awesome. Okay, why is it awesome? What did we have before versus where we're at right now? What improvement was made to make the figure worth having? You look at Quick Kick as an original Joe, O-ring construction, 3 3/4 inch. The evolution was to make them taller, bigger, 6 inches, give them better, you know, a little bit more articulation, a better grip on their weapons, like bigger hands and a more realistic grip, and the ability to properly two-hand a rifle and things like that. And we ended up with Cops, and that was the evolution, right? Cops didn't pick up the way we expected, but it was an evolution. You know what I mean? When you look back at the history of figures, they did this back in the 80s, and then now they've done similar things, and I'm going to get to them shortly. They've done similar things with G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe is weird because G.I. Joe always has the evolution and regression and then evolution, where they repeat what they've done in the past. You know what I mean? You could look at the original Joes that were 12 inch, then they went down to 3 3/4 inch to save money. Then, you know, later on we had like Sigma 6, but here is a good example of what we've been doing for the last couple decades. You had Pursuit of Cobra, so you had your 25th anniversary. You had Marauders, who came in and just showed you that with a little bit of tweaking, you could make those Joes perfect. Each one of these things, though, was perfection for the time, because people didn't expect more because there was nothing to compare it to. Then Joy Toy comes along, and then they take all of that to a whole nother level. Now you're seeing what you truly could do in this scale. You know, Boss Fight is in there too, but it's the same people that sculpted the Marauders figures. So it's not that big of a, you know, of a difference when you're moving from those things. A lot of the Boss Fight guys sculpted the Pursuit of Cobra stuff. That's why there's that similar feel, and you could tell that where they had to cut corners while working for Hasbro, they had the freedom to kind of go nuts when they started working for themselves as Boss Fight and working with Marauders. You can see the bend in the Marauders Duke's arm is better than the bend in the Pursuit of Cobra one. But I still love that Pursuit of Cobra figure. You know, it fit the bill for what it was trying to do at the time. What's the next evolution? Classifieds. The details are the same. It almost feels like they looked at Marauders and they said, let's upscale that and then add double jointed, you know, articulation a la Marvel Legends, and we can go from there. It's an evolution. You know, the reason why some people dig the classifieds so much is because they wanted this stuff that they used to get in a larger scale. Now, does it make as much sense as, you know, the original smaller stuff? To me, it doesn't, because the vehicle, you're not going to get all the vehicles in 6-inch scale. You're just not. You know, most people aren't going to be able to afford that, but collectors are a special breed. You know, they'll figure out a way to try to afford it, but I think it was more cost effective to stay in 3 3/4 inches, but having 6-inch, really detailed, really posable versions of your favorite Joes, that's kind of cool. That's the only way I planned on dipping into this, was picking up the guys that are my favorites. And, you know, I've shown you this. But it's not a rabbit hole that I plan on jumping all the way down. I'm kind of in it, but I'm not going all the way down that rabbit hole. But all of these that I've shown you, it's a level of expectation that tempers your idea of perfection. You know what I mean? It's a toy. It's going to have limits. But some toys perfectly encapsulate what they're supposed to be. Look at these guys. They're all tokusatsu figures. Every last one of them comes from a live action tokusatsu show, and their suits are all represented perfectly here on these figures. And I have a bunch of eras of figures. You know, the smaller Yellow Ranger you see there was from Bandai when they were doing their Legacy collection. The larger Black Ranger up there, right above her, is from the Legacy collection when they did their movie a couple years back. Then you have a Kiba Ranger from Bandai in the Figuarts. You have a Hurricaneger, a Hurricane Blue from Hurricaneger. That's also SH Figuarts. And then the Blue Ranger, Magna Defender, the Yellow Ranger from Go Busters, and the Red Ranger from SPD are all Hasbro. This is all when they started to really take it seriously that they could bridge the gap between your Figuarts, which are imports, and your domestic figures. But they all are setting out to do the same thing. They're setting out to capture the whole Japanese live-action superhero look and then give them articulation so that they can pose properly. And you can see how from the smaller Legacy Collection figure all the way to, you know, the red SPD Ranger, you know, the articulation increased because they were improving on things, but each of them were the standard at a point in time. It's just the way that this works, you know. It's unfair if you don't acknowledge this. The figures I have listed or pictured here, they all represent capturing the actual likeness and essence of that particular style, or how these people showed up, these characters showed up in other forms of media in 3D form, and they do it perfectly. You know, there's people who are going to nitpick, you know, the Batman's horn is kind of warped a little bit. That's how it came in the package, and no matter what I do, I can't straighten it out, even when I soften it with heat and then use cold. Once I've straightened it, it always comes back to that point. But, you know, people will nitpick and they'll say all kinds of shit. But if you're being fair and your expectations are realistic, these guys all, and they're all NECA. I know people, since Retro Blasting did their thing, everybody wants to say the NECA figures suck and stuff like that. My Turtles are in perfect condition, and I play with them. You know what I mean? My Batman, nothing's happened to him, and I play with him. The same thing goes for Drake, Ripley especially. I play with them, nothing's happened to them. They are tough enough. They're amazing representations that are super accurate because these sculpts are just on another level. And they have enough articulation that they're modern without feeling like a good sculpt with shitty, you know, retro articulation. Because, you know, there are companies that do that. And this isn't the case here. These guys have enough articulation to pass muster, you know? Alright, let's talk about higher end figures and import figures. Because there is a difference, and they also do set out to do some specific things. So now, I put some of these, like Alfred's not necessarily higher end, but everybody else here is. Alfred I put in here because he's kind of in between. He's a one-of-a-kind figure in the sense that we don't have very many Alfred figures, you know? So on the secondary, he goes for a high price. Typically, I'm not talking about the secondary. All these other figures cost more than what our domestic figures cost, but they all do the thing that they set out to do extremely well, if not perfectly. Ultraman looks like Ultraman, you know. Green Arrow, it's an amazing redesign. Deku looks exactly like Deku, and I mean, what do you have to say about Warden, you know? Let's move over to some Kamen Riders. Now, these are going to be like some of the cream of the crop figures. When people say, you know, there's no such thing as perfection, there's no perfect figures, it's bullshit. Like I said, it's It's a frame of mind, and it only is attainable if your expectations are set correctly. This was set out to mimic the way Takeshi Hongo looked in the early, what was that, the 66 series. That's what they were imitating. That's what we got. It's a perfect representation. I mean, you can nitpick the hell out of this if you would like to, but I see exactly what I was watching way back in the day, watching those old cheesy episodes of Kamen Rider. That's what they set out to do. That's what they succeeded in. Bruce Lee, Figuarts, again, they did a really great job capturing all of the mannerisms, the details, the expression, everything of Bruce Lee, to the point where when you put him side by side with various photos of Bruce Lee, you see how perfect the figure actually is. You know what I mean? And these are all facts, and I'm using these photos to put next, side by side with these pictures so that you can see the figure and what it was referencing, and you can see how well they captured the essence of what they were referencing. The tokusatsu figures especially, this is Kamen Rider Sango, they especially capture that essence. With the Bruce Lee figure and the Hongo figure, they're outliers because there's not that many likenesses that are that crisp and clear in Figuarts. This guy, look at him, and then look at the suit actor. There's like pretty much no difference other than there's some warping around the crotch area of the suit and around the, any joints, like major joints, like in the shoulder, in the underarm area, armpits. But, I mean, it's dead on. It's like unmistakable, Now, I didn't show a figure of, or a live action of Fies, because this is a redesign, a high-end redesign of Fies based on some artwork. You can see I got the artwork right there. It's pretty dope. I mean, it's a lot of detail. You can see what they were doing. They were taking the design from the live action, and then they were trying to make it look a little bit more higher end. It's already a high-end design. This is just, it's literal perfection. It doesn't get better than this. Now, these guys here, they're mostly Figmas, and then there's one Bandai figure. And these guys all do exactly what I just showed you, starting with the NECA stuff, in spades. They're representational, but then their articulation is on that next level, so they can do all kinds of shit, especially the poses and, like, famous, famous poses and famous movements you see them do in their respective franchises. And these are all mostly anime, and one guy's a video game character. I mean, technically, I guess the Type Moon characters, like Ruler here, Joan of Arc, come from a video game, essentially. But as you can see, all of her details are perfectly captured, but then there's also room for proper humanoid movement, Her articulation is on point, but I mean, like, there's just no mistaking how accurate this figure is. Now, would you say that's not perfection? You know what I mean? There's a lot of people who, they play with that word and they complain and they make these really crazy claims about things not being perfect, and I think they're just not into the right things to give them examples, to give them a chance to experience this. Here is Emiya Kiritsugu from Fate Zero. I mean, that's Emiya. I mean, it's the main character from the rest of the Fate series. It's his father, and there's just no mistaking who that is. You know what I mean? It's legit. There is Arthur Pendragon. So you've seen Saber 2.0, the figure, and you've heard me rant and rave about that figure. And this is her male counterpart, technically the original Arthur from Fate Prototype. This figure, I mean, I'm going to show you more of him in another video, but there's just no mistaking who that is. The details are 100% accurate. The colors match. Everything is there, and then he's super articulated. You see him sitting up top on a horse. and it doesn't look stupid. I didn't have to contort him or anything like that. So, you know, this pursuit of perfection, you have to understand what it is you're looking for. You have to, I mean, in some cases you got to pay a pretty penny for it, but in many cases, if you look in the correct place, you will find examples of figures that perfectly encapsulate the entire experience of the character. That's Archer, also from the Fate series. He's what Kiritsugu's son grows up to become before being killed. But I mean, can you tell me that those two don't, you know, it doesn't look like one is the action figure version of the other? McCree slash Cassidy. This figure, you've seen the Hasbro attempt, which is actually damn good. It's a really good attempt. But this is the Figma. A little shinier, much better articulation, that little bit more accuracy to the design, and there's just nothing left to ask for this from this figure. It does everything I could want it to do. I mean, he even came with extra stogies to be smoking on, you know? Garo, like, shit. This figure blew me away. I waited a long time for this figure. I had missed the original Makai Kato, the Makai Kato. If you know, you know. I missed the original one and then got this one. And mainly, it's the only Garo figure I have. Mainly because of how accurate this figure is. And then on top of the accuracy and the size, how articulated, you know, how much articulation he has, the range of motion and everything. I can do whatever I saw Garo do in the show, I can do it with this figure. I can pose him how I want him to pose, and nothing's falling off and all that weird stuff. Like, it's a very accurate looking figure. And I'm going to show you, you know, a live action picture of Garo in his armor. And then on top of it, it's just a fun toy. That's the balance that needs to be met with these figures in a lot of cases. And I think if you look in certain places, you will never find that, because a lot of companies are not concerned with that. Certain companies are. What I find with imports is that a lot of times the import companies are more concerned with that, so much so that they will attempt multiple times to get it right. I mean, that's the difference, you know. I've mentioned this before when I was talking about the Captain America figures from Figuarts versus the ones from Hasbro. And then here she is, Queen Dingaling. That doesn't even sound right. Queen Dingaling. The queen of the figures, the queen of all figures, Saber 2.0. Everything about this figure encapsulates exactly, you know, how awesome, how regal, you know, how powerful this character actually is, even with that tiny frame of hers. This figure still blows me away to this day. And, you know, a lot of figures have been released since this figure came out. And just her engineering, the sublime small details, everything on her just works perfectly for the benefit of the whole. And when we're talking about perfection, she's like the poster child for it. And there's just no mistaking who she's supposed to be. Now, I'm pretty sure that image there is a fan art, but it's a damn good fan art, and it's so close to what I had her, the pose I had her in, that I was like, yo, I have to put this up there. But just no mistaking. Look at the details on the sword, you know? It's the same. All you can't see is the little inscription going up the blade, but it's Saber, you know what I mean? Like, there's just no mistaking who that is. And that's what we're talking about when I say there are perfect figures. And of course, we have come to the bottom line. I don't know, this one is more of, you know, this is a discussion, so it's not so much like, you know, typical reviews and such, but the main thing is that your expectations are everything. When you go into collecting figures, and this goes for new collectors and old collectors alike, when you start out doing this, you start out taking that step to jump into collecting figures, it's not about just getting the trendy new shit, because that's what it's become. It's about understanding why this shit is awesome in the first place. What makes it fully awesome? Understanding that, like, your expectations have to fit with what they set out, what that brand set out to do. You know what I mean? The brand has to set out to, you know, to create a really good 5 points of articulation figure, or a great superposable action figure. That's essentially what you have to be working with. You know what I'm saying? That's what you're looking for. And if you understand what the brand, what the company was setting out to do, you won't be always underwhelmed with what they create. Now, there are times where there are figures that come out and they promise one thing and then they give you something else. That's not what I'm talking about in this video. I'm just talking about your overall expectations for what a figure can do and how well it can do it, and how well sometimes that is actually done with the final product versus what your expectation may have been. You know, if you're going into collecting reaction figures but you want McFarlane levels of detail and articulation, then obviously you're going to be disappointed, right? Two different things that set out to do two different things. I've shown a lot of old figures because it was a simpler time when a lot of these figures were released. 5 points of articulation and everything, but they had cool art accessories in some cases, but the likeness was so good to the source material that in most cases, like for me, I didn't give a shit about what they came with. I was focused on getting the group from the show and having accurate looking shows, you know? Now, you can't have one perspective, one generic perspective. You know, like every figure has to be a Marvel Legends. Like, that's stupid, because every figure isn't made by Hasbro. It's not handled by the Marvel Legends team, and not every, you know, Marvel Legends shouldn't be your be-all, end-all. There are better and there are worse companies and worse, you know, action figure lines that do more or less, you know. If you're looking for an awesome representation of certain characters, you can expect NECA to blow that shit out of the water, and it'll be affordable. Now, sometimes, if you're looking for the level of articulation that you want to get from a Figuarts or a Figma, you're just not going to get that with your NECA figures. You'll get close, but you won't get the same exact thing. So again, it's understanding what you're working with, understand what each brand brings to the table, and don't confuse the two. You know, I remember when the import companies like Bandai started making figures of American heroes, and you'd watch the Foosh giving them shit and making fun of the joints, you know, complaining about the joints. I shouldn't say making fun of, but, you know, these joints are weird. I don't really like these joints, you know what I mean? These are kind of weird. But they're not meant to work the way American action figures work. What you were afforded with those weird joints gave you a greater range of motion than what you got in most cases with anything coming out of a domestic company. So, you know what I mean? These are the things that you want to take into account, so that way you don't end up being one of those sounding like, you know, you have no idea what you're doing because you clearly were jumping on the bandwagon, and you actually, you know, you'll sound informed, you'll be informed, and then you'll enjoy things a little bit more, you know what I'm saying? Because you know what to expect from each of the companies that you're dealing with. So that has been my look at the concept of perfection versus your expectations when it comes to being an action figure collector. I think it's an important distinction to make. I think this is an important discussion to have, because, you know, we discuss a whole lot of other kind of less important stuff when it comes to action figures, but this base level thing, this super ground level concept, you got adult collectors that don't see this, you know? And I hate having these discussions where you try to, you know, bring a logical kind of perspective to this stuff, and all it is, oh, it's new, it's shiny, I want it. It should be more than that, you know, because this stuff, most of this shit's gonna outlive us. Sounds weird, right? but most of this shit is gonna outlive us. So if you're gonna have this in your space, it's taking up room, real estate in your house, and you're gonna see it on a day-to-day basis, and you want to keep it, I mean, you should at least appreciate it on a base level and understand what makes it worth the appreciation, besides nostalgia and it being new and shiny at one point in its life. So anyway, that's it for me. You guys have been great. Get at me in the comments. I want to hear what people think about this. I want to hear where you guys come to this sort of thing. Like, what perspective do you have on this conversation? Do you get where I'm coming from? You don't have to, but, do you? And, yeah, we'll chat it out like we normally do. So, that's it for me. You guys have been great. Peace outside.